Yeah, hello, my name's Jack, that's me on Twitter, and I'm here to talk to you today about migrating software. I just firstly want to say a big thank you to the organizers, the attendees, my fellow speakers. It's been an amazing event. It's my second trip to Warsaw, but the last time was about 15 years ago, so it's been great to come back and experience it. And when I was putting together these slides, what I realized is that really the talk isn't about Angular to React as much as it's just about migrating complicated pieces of software. And even if you're not currently migrating or you're not doing Angular to React like I've been at work, I hope that still there'll be bits of this talk that you will find useful. Just to give you a bit of context on where I'm working and what I'm migrating, I work for a company called Songkick. Who's heard of Songkick out of interest? All right, not bad, thank you. So there's two parts of Songkick. One is we help you find gigs based on artists you listen to on Spotify and whatnot. And the second part is we have a ticketing platform, and we sell tickets for gigs for artists. And it's that platform that I'm going to talk to you about today. We call it the store, and this is what it looks like. Apologies for the white, like the blinding light. This is what it looks like. So for a particular artist, it lists all the dates that they're playing at certain venues, and you can buy tickets for them. But what we do is this gets embedded into websites of artists who work for us. So we helped Adele sell tickets for her upcoming tour. And this is that same product, but placed on Adele.com inside an iframe. If buy me a drink later, I'll tell you all about iframes and start crying, because yeah, I'm sure some people in here can sympathize with iframes. But we put this product onto websites, and we help people buy tickets to gigs, which is basically the best part of my job, is seeing like people tweeting about stuff when they get tickets. So I call this product the store. So when I'm talking about the store in this talk, that's what I mean. I mean that platform that we sell tickets on. And just to give you a bit of background on this, it was built 2.5 years ago, built on Angular 1. This is before I was at Songkick. Tickets are being sold on this constantly. It can never really be offline. We're literally always selling tickets. And it's also the thing that is used by like our big flagship clients that we like to talk about. And actually, the store works pretty well. Sure, it has some edge cases, it has a few niggles and a few bugs that we don't like, but it actually, for the most part, it sells tickets to users, and they get their tickets, and they go to the gigs, and they're very happy. However, changing the store is very tricky. Like, working on the code is very tricky. It's a very old code base, built by developers who, for various reasons, are no longer at the company. It runs on an older version of Angular 1. It's not even 1.6 or whatever the latest version is. There's been a lot of feature bloat over the years as features have been added that we don't necessarily need anymore. So really, when we're working on it, we struggle to make changes. What it really comes down to is we're not able to iterate, we're not able to quickly respond to bug reports or build new features. Effectively, we lack confidence in the system. And that means that if we fix a bug, it's very tricky for me to be confident that I haven't introduced another bug. And that really was the main motivation for making this migration. Not only were we on quite an old version of a framework that no one at Songkick really particularly evangelizes or is fond of, but the code was in such a state that we couldn't work on it and we couldn't iterate quickly. And that's a problem, because we want to add a lot of features to the product. We have a lot of plans, and right now this is holding us back. So we sat down and we started planning the migration. And really, I've broken this talk down into what I've called the 4 T's. So we've got the tech, the tests, the team, and the talking as well. So to start with the tech, it hopefully isn't too much of a surprise to you based on the title of this talk that we picked React. We picked it for a number of reasons that I won't go into too much detail here just because I don't have time. But the main thing for me is that the people on my team are very familiar with React, but also we like that React is, you don't write as much code that's bundled up with the framework. So React lets you write a lot of plain JavaScript, and that was really the big winner for us. And when you're going to start migrating a project, there's 2 approaches you can take. There's the big bang rewrite versus the incremental kind of slow improvements over time. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you would consider doing a big bang rewrite. You don't have to maintain any old stuff. You don't have to put up with the fact that you're stuck on a really old version of something. You can just start from scratch with all the latest gadgets and go from there. However, in reality, in a real application, the big bang rewrites cause you problems. So imagine we've got our legacy app at the top, and there's the new app being built from scratch using React and whatever else we're using at the bottom. So you've got some poor person draws a short straw, and they maintain your legacy app. and the rest of us are really happy, and we start building the new app. But over a long period of time, we don't actually add much value. The only time we add value is when we get to the end and we're on feature parity and we can swap to using that new version. For all that other time at the bottom, users were still using our legacy app, there were still bugs in our legacy app, and the new app wasn't being used. If you contrast that with the approach of kind of rebuilding from the inside, you add value straight away. So here we've got the gray old app and the nice orange new app. And we're adding value immediately because we're migrating little bits to React and improving those bits as we go. And as time goes on, you just keep adding more and more value until eventually you consume the whole app, and then that's your new app done and your migration finished. So for us, really, it was a pretty straightforward decision to go bit by bit. We're able to release early and often. Doing this also means you can migrate one thing and then learn from it and migrate the next thing a bit better. So you're constantly improving that process. And we're also able to not break any existing functionality. We have users buying tickets on the store constantly. We want to release lots. That means we can't break anything. Ultimately, if you as a user buy a ticket once a week to a different gig, you should never really be aware that under the hood, all the code is changing. There's actually a term for this by Martin Fowler. This is called a strangler application. This approach is called strangling. And it's based on these trees that he found in Queensland. There's a link there, and I'll put the slides up and tweet them later so you can grab the links. And I should also thank the former VP of Tech at Songkick, Sabrina, because when I joined Songkick, I was chatting to her, and she was the one who introduced me to this concept. She's doing a big talk on rewrites at the Lead Dev Conf, which is an excellent conference I'd highly recommend. And the best thing about this approach, in my opinion, was we shipped migrated React code the day after we started the migration, which I think is pretty impressive. Sure, it was an absolutely tiny component that did one tiny thing. It just outputted the title for a particular gig. But we kind of immediately proved our assumption that we could do it in this way, and that was really nice. In terms of the theory, or how we're actually going about doing the migration, it's all based around components, which has been a kind of running theme of this conference, really, so it's good that we're all familiar. For those of you who haven't used Angular, I might refer to them as directives. Angular 1 roughly calls directives what React and other frameworks would call a component. So for the purposes of this talk, components and directive are mostly the same. And when you have an app built of components or Angular directives, you can picture it as a big tree. You have the big top-level component, that renders some other components, that renders some more, and then it goes down many more layers than I could be bothered to do a diagram of. And the idea here is that we can start at the bottom of the tree and work our way up, replacing really small bits with React, and then slowly and slowly replacing bigger bits. So first we swap this bit, and then we swap those, and now at this point, that whole part of the tree can become React. Now, this is a really nice plan in theory. I can assure you that it's not always quite as straightforward in practice, but on the whole, it does mostly get us to where we need to be. So we sat down and we planned, and we whiteboarded, and we started breaking down the app into what we wanted to migrate. And really, this is a case of looking at the app and just looking at all the different parts and picturing the components that will be needed to make up of them. So here we have a fan club component at the top that lets you sign into the artist's fan club. And we have what is called a listing row, which lists one of the gigs that this particular artist is playing. But of course, that's quite a high level. That's like quite a top part of the tree. So you can break down those components into smaller ones. So you can see we have a listings date, a title, the title being one of the very first things we migrated, and then the buttons as well. And sometimes we have different buttons for VIP tickets or regular tickets. And really, your app is just a big bunch of these components. And so migrating is really just a case of going one by one through them. So the actual process of doing this migration is you find all the dependencies that a directive uses. You migrate all of those one by one to React. You're then in a position to write the new component, so you write your React component. And then we come to needing to actually place that into the Angular app. So for those who aren't familiar with Angular, Angular uses kind of HTML templates, and a directive in Angular is used as if it was a custom HTML element. So this listings button here is an Angular directive. We want to swap that out for the brand new React button we just built. And there is an amazing library called ng-react, which lets you render React into Angular, which I thought was a bit of a joke at first, but is actually like a really, really good piece of software that's made this migration way easier than we thought it might be. So with ng-react, we can use the React component that it provides, which is not confusing at all. And we give it the name of the React component we want, and we pass in any properties. And now that's rendering that React app into the page. And then we continue this strategy. If you think back to that tree, we can now swap the next bit, which is the title, and that goes into a listings title component. So really, at this point, we've migrated all the lowest level of children to React. So now we can do that parent node, and we create a listings item, which renders both of those smaller components. And then we update our template. And now at this point, we're at that point of the tree. And that is largely, barring a few details which I've left out because I don't have 10 hours to talk to you, that is most of what we have to do. And we do that for what feels like sometimes forever. But we do, that is a good way of making progress and slowly growing React into our application from the inside. So that's the first T. That's the tech for now. I next want to talk about tests. So our main problem, or the main thing to bear in mind here, is we cannot break the store. Like, users rely on this. The rest of the company relies on this. And if we break it, it's not us who get shouted at. It's the rest of the company who gets shouted at from our clients. So we have unit tests. The old app was actually pretty well tested, which has really helped. So we can migrate unit tests from Angular to React and add to them and extend them as appropriate. As an aside, if you'd like to know more about testing React components, I wrote a blog post on SitePoint fairly recently about testing them. And again, I'll share the slides later. There's one issue, though, when it comes to migrating with unit tests, and that's that they're very tightly coupled to the code that they test. If you move one component from Angular to React, you have to move its tests. The Angular tests aren't going to work with the React component. So that means really that the tests, whilst they verify things are working, they don't test that you've maintained the features 100%, because ultimately you've had to migrate the tests as well as the actual code. What we wanted was a layer of tests that were entirely unaware of the underlying code, and if that code was React or Angular or whatever it might have been. And they come in the form of acceptance tests, or the necessary evil of the web. These are tests that run for us automatically. And they fire up a browser, and they click around, and they try and add tickets to an event, and they try and break it, and they make sure things are working as they should. And these are amazing when you're doing a migration, because they are entirely decoupled to the application code. All the acceptance test gets is click a button, or fill in this form. It doesn't know if that's an Angular form or a React form or whatever. There are some downsides to acceptance tests, though, as I'm sure we all know. They are very slow to run. We don't have that many, and they take about 12 minutes. Which is, yeah, it's quite a long time. So we've limited them to the core user experience. So we don't test every edge case, but we make sure that our most common flows through the application are covered. One thing we started doing a bit more recently is running our acceptance tests in Internet Explorer to catch any IE-specific bugs. In the long run, we'd like to run our acceptance tests across all the browsers, and including mobile devices that we'd like to support. But right now, we can only run them on one for various reasons. So we picked IE because I work in Chrome, my colleague works in Firefox. We'll spot bugs in those browsers. Funnily enough, not many of us are developing in IE 11 on a day-to-day basis. And next up, it's the team. And when I first proposed this talk, and I did the very first version of it a while ago, most of the talk was more technical, and actually I dived right into the React stuff. And if you do want to hear more about that, then please come and grab me afterwards. I'd love to chat to you about it. But as the project has gone on, I've come to realize that it's been a lot more important that we manage the team and the softer skills as well as the actual technical things that we're up to as well. And for me, it's been a very new experience working on a project that has spanned such a long period of time. I've worked on product teams before, but we'd always used to work in kind of 4 weeks, or maybe 2-week sprints, or a big 6-week project, for example. We've been going for at least 9 months now. And I'm imagining there'll be at least 3, if not a bit more months to go. So it's just quite a long time to be working on one real goal. So keeping people happy and productive as you do that is actually quite tricky, because ultimately, a lot of the work is the same kind of thing over and over again. And for us, it's been bearing in mind the momentum and prioritization, and making sure, A, that people feel like work is going at a good pace and we're getting stuff out the door, but also knowing what to prioritize and not getting overwhelmed. There is so much code that we have to deal with. Some of it, we're lucky, we can just delete it. That's the best. Some of it has to be migrated, but it's fairly straightforward. Some of it has to be migrated, and it's going to take an absolute age to do, because you have to first begin to try to understand it. And one of the goals of the migration was to make it easier to fix bugs and respond to issues with confidence. And when we fix a bug, be very confident that we haven't introduced anything else. So what we started doing was pick work based on the bugs and the churn rate rather than the code quality itself. It's very tempting to come across a file that you struggle to understand because the code isn't as good as it could be. And you think, well, we should migrate this next because this is hard to understand. But if that particular piece of code isn't causing you any bugs and users aren't hitting any issues with it, that shouldn't be high on your priority list. The high stuff should be the stuff that's hitting users every day, the bugs that you have that users fall into. Even if that's some of the best Angular code you've ever seen in your life, ultimately that's causing problems, and we should deal with that. So we kind of plan work out based on the quality of the code, kind of bearing that in mind. The churn rate, where churn here means the amount of times in, say, a working week that you touch or edit a particular file. So there's one file that's very hard for you to understand, and it's a file that every day when you're working on the app, you end up opening in your editor because maybe it's got too many fingers all over the place reaching out. That is going to cause you problems. However, if there's a file that's really badly written, but you never have to edit it, it kind of works and it does its job, and you barely even know it exists, that's not as urgent. So looking at these, we'd probably pick the last thing as the most important, because both the churn and the bug rate are very high. And then depending on how you want to do things, you might prioritize them slightly differently. But most of the time, we're picking based on bugs and churn rather than the actual quality of the underlying code. And in any migration as well, there will be big bits of work and small bits of work. Some Angular directives will be very small. They might just output the date, for example. And so they're pretty straightforward to convert to React, and they're very easy to test. Some bits will be much more complicated. For example, we recently moved the credit card form from Angular to React, which, as you can imagine, is more complicated and also had to have a lot more testing around it to ensure that we hadn't broken it. I think I even spent about $20 on the production store testing it as well, so that's really not ideal. Definitely test on small amounts of money, by the way. I nearly bought a $100 ticket by mistake. And we also, to manage this, we keep a large backlog in Trello. You could use whatever tool of your choice. It doesn't really matter. And we have lots of work, including design and UX improvements we want to get to. We're just starting to really look into the accessibility of the app and improve that as we go. But it's really good for us to have a big backlog of varied work that people can pick up to keep themselves interested. And even if you are doing a large piece of work, like, say, the credit card form, you can split it down into a bunch of smaller bits that you can work on incrementally. So another big part of the migration we just completed, which actually was released yesterday, was the queues. So when we're selling tickets for a big on-sale, and we get maybe over 100,000 people trying to buy tickets, we can't have them all trying at the same time because we can't handle that amount of load. So the store is able to queue users and let a certain amount through every 10, 20 seconds. And this was causing us some bugs. We had a couple of poor users get stuck in the queue far longer than they should have, which got them very frustrated, understandably, and it got us very frustrated. So we decided to prioritize this work. And it was a big piece of work. It probably took a couple of weeks, all in all. But rather than do one big pull request right at the end, we did lots of small ones. And this was the actual checklist from Trello that I was ticking off. And when you're doing work like this as well, you want to be able to get your colleagues to review it in smaller increments. I think we all know that if you give a colleague a 2,000-line pull request to review, they'll probably glance over it and say, yeah, it looks good. But if you give them a 10, 20-line pull request, they'll probably leave about 50 comments on it. So finding that happy medium where people leave good reviews that isn't too nitpicky but isn't too glancy is very good. And to do that, we've been using feature branches quite a lot. So let's say I'm going to work on the queue. So we create the queue master branch, which is like the master branch of the queue work, and it lives alongside the actual real-life master, which is our kind of production branch. And then I'm working on the first of those Trello cards. So I check out a new branch called queue part 1 from my master queue branch. So I do my bit of work, whatever that is, and I make a pull request. But I don't make the pull request into the actual master. I make it into my queue master. But now I've got a pull request that my colleague can look at and review and give me feedback. This also means that they are also more aware of what I'm doing and the approach I'm taking. And then you can do that over and over again until you're finally ready to merge the queue master into the actual master. And by the time you've done this shouldn't need much review because each of these smaller pull requests has hopefully been reviewed. But whenever possible, rather than doing this, we always try to release early and release often. It keeps up momentum. We're usually migrating something every day. We're usually deploying a migration. It's easier to react to a bug if a release causes it. And that was a pun on purpose. So I couldn't quite hear you laughing, so I wasn't sure if you noticed. But yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And another thing we've been doing is following what's called the Scouts rule. And this comes from like scouting in the olden days where like, people went to campsites and they caught rabbits and had them over a fire. But it's always leave things better than when you found them. And this was initially applied to campsites, but you can also apply it to components and code as well. The idea here is even if you have half an hour to work on something, because it's the end of the day or you've got half an hour between a meeting or whatever, you should still be able to, we should have cards in the backlog that are small enough that you can pick them up and do them. Even if you might not be able to finish a migration in half an hour, you can kind of get the ball rolling. And it's important to remember as well that a migrated code base is not a perfect code base. There seems to be this weird idea that when you migrate something, the code you produce at the end has to be absolutely perfect. And I can assure you that is certainly not the case for me. When you're migrating code, often when you're migrating it, you just have to understand it and get it working and get it on feature parity. You can always come back to a migrated code later and work on it some more. And every time you touch some code and you work with it, you learn more about that code and how it works and all its edge cases. So you shouldn't try to make it perfect now because you can't, because in a few weeks' time when you come back to it, you'll probably have some extra information that you can use. And there's another thing that we've been trying to do in terms of helping the team share knowledge about this React migration and how it's working. And we call this the lottery factor. This is basically the happier version of the bus factor, which is how many people in your team would get hit by a bus before you're in trouble. This is how many people in your team would win the lottery and retire to like a tropical island, which is a bit more cheerier. So we really try to share the knowledge of what we're working on, because ultimately a lot of it is in our heads. I did a lot of the early planning on it, so a lot of it I had to try and get out of my head. And we found if you put this in a Google Doc or anywhere like that, it just goes out of date, and no one knows where it is. So we've actually started storing it in the repository itself. So we created what's called the knowledge base, which is a very fancy word for a markdown file. And in here, we just put odds and ends, little bits of info that we might need. Stuff that I know because I've worked on it that might be a bit weird to my colleague who hasn't. And this has been really helpful when you do a pull request. Anything weird, you just dump a little entry into this knowledge base. It's not really formatted. We don't care about how it's laid out. And that's been really helpful. And because this is a long-running project, you should definitely make sure you can track what you're doing in the form of metrics. And these can be really, really rudimentary metrics. They don't have to be scientifically accurate. They just have to give you a sense of what's going on. So here's one I wrote. I'm dreadful at bash, so excuse me in advance. But it searched for files in our code that looked Angular-y. They had like a mention of Angular in them. And then it searched for files that had React in them. Now this is the this is the worst A/B test type thing, or there is no science here. This is just me messing around. But you can see that when I ran this a few months ago, we had 126 Angular files and 122 React files. I ran this yesterday. I've also changed my terminal theme, just to let you know. And we now have 80 Angular files, and we have 159 React files. Now, that doesn't, those numbers are kind of irrelevant, but the fact that we can see they're heading in the right direction is quite nice. And actually, we have a Jenkins pipeline that deploys, and it runs this every single time, so we can see how we're progressing. And it keeps us happy, like we know we're heading in the right direction. Something we share a bit more externally with the company is the migration spreadsheet. And again, because we wanted to come up with a number, like how close are we? So we kind of had a rough guess, and we assigned some things some points, and they roughly work out to percentages. Again, the actual numbers here don't matter, and that 43% probably isn't accurate. It's out by about 42% probably. But this does at least give you an idea. And we update this as we do work, and I checked it yesterday, and we're on 70. So even though those numbers mean nothing to you, they mean very little to me, they at least tell us that we're heading in the right direction and we're making really good progress. Migration is also a really good chance to talk about tooling. If you're not all asleep because of the fatigue, migrations are a really good chance to upgrade your tools and start experimenting with new ones. It's also a really nice break to get away from working with some application code as well. If you've been migrating components for weeks or code that makes API requests, all that stuff, it's quite heavy and it can be frustrating at times. So getting away from that and thinking, well, I'm just going to experiment with a new tool, or I'm going to upgrade something, it can be really nice. We've moved from Browserify to Webpack, and we've moved from Karma to Jest as a result of doing this work alongside the migration, and they've both been really beneficial. So if you are working on a big, long-running project like the migration, you need to make sure you have a mix of all these different types of tasks to keep everyone interested and motivated. Big, small, visual ones, under-the-hood ones, tooling, whatever it might be, hopefully you need to keep people interested over what is a pretty long period of time. So my final T is talking. And this is something that I've really had to adapt to at Songkick. It's not something I've had to necessarily do that much before in other companies. But when we sat down to plan the migration, we talked to the appropriate people in the technology team who we effectively had to convince that this was a good idea. And that was fairly straightforward. But the most important people to convince, I discovered, weren't in the tech team. They were in all the other teams. They're in the teams that deal with angry users because our product doesn't work quite right. They're in the teams that deal with angry clients because our store isn't listing their tickets as it should be for their big artists that they manage. And it's those people you have to convince. And as I've discovered, they actually don't care about frameworks. I mean, who knew? But when you talk to them, you explain that, well, we're probably not going to add many features for about a year. That's quite scary for them to hear, understandably. And so when they first asked me to explain it, I went about it as a typical developer. Well, Angular 1 is reaching end of life, and React offers a much better component model. That didn't do it. React's lifecycle methods and small API is easier for developers to learn. Also didn't do it. React state model is less magical. Its unidirectional data flow really simplifies code. I mean, I don't even know what that means. So no one had a hope of understanding. And then what I realized is we want to talk about why we're doing this, why we're in the position where we feel we can justify taking such a long time and a lot of developer time to do it. So we went things like when you ask for a new feature or a bug fix, it takes a lot of time at the moment because of how the code is. Obviously, we went into a bit more detail in reality. Or we have a lot of users who buy tickets on mobile. And right now, the store with all its JavaScript and some of it quite old, it doesn't perform that well on mobile, which is a shame, but it's something we want to get to. So explaining that by doing this migration, we lay the foundation for new features, quicker bug fixes, a much improved experience and performance for all our users is definitely the way that really helped people understand. And although you're not strictly doing features and fixing lots of bugs, you can get some quick wins to help everyone and make them understand what's happening. As you migrate code, you can look out for bugs in that area that you can fix. So one such example is we had a few people who they put their credit card details in, they hit submit, and for whatever reason, there was a small bug in the Angular code that meant that very few of them, like one in less than 1,000, no, more than 1,000, would get stuck in this payment processing state where they didn't know if their order had succeeded or failed, and they couldn't do anything. And they basically, their only solution was to email customer support, and they get quite frustrated, which is totally understandable. So when we heard that this was happening, we decided, well, we'll migrate that sooner rather than later. So we put a message in Slack telling everyone that this had happened, and we got a really good response out of it. So kind of demonstrating that by migrating stuff, we can fix these bugs as we go helps people understand and keeps them happy as well. So really, it's just keeping people in the loop. Unfortunately, though, we're not all perfect, and sometimes things do go wrong. Ultimately, if you're working on a large project and you're deploying it every day, there will occasionally be a fire, as we call it. Something will eventually go wrong, and there will be some migration that brings a bug in. We try as hard as we can to not have that happen, but unfortunately, at some point, it will. I saw this expressed really well on Twitter, and really annoyingly, I can't find the tweet that had it. So if someone does know this, please let me know, so I'd love to add it to the slides. But it says there are two types of developer in the world. There are those who have broken production, and there are those who are about to break production, which I think sums it up pretty nicely. At this point, I have to apologize to 3 people who bought tickets for a concert on the wrong day in Tokyo because I can't do time zones in JavaScript. I'm not sure if anyone can do time zones in JavaScript. I haven't figured that one out. So when this happens, people actually don't mind because we've got into a really good way of communicating what goes on. What went wrong? Why didn't we catch it? How did we fix it? And most importantly, how we prevent it happening again. If we see every one of these production slip-ups as an opportunity, then we can really start to improve things and improve the communication with the business. So we send what's called fire-out emails, and they explain what went wrong, an explanation of the bug, how we fixed it, most importantly, why we didn't catch it in production, or in testing, sorry, before it made it to production, and finally, the follow-up steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. And what I found is once you get into this habit, you get into really good dialogues with the people outside the engineering about what their biggest issues are with the store, where users go wrong, and you learn a lot from it that you can put into your work as well. So just to finish up, I've got a few takeaways for you, just to surmise. That was the worst pun, I'm sorry. Firstly, don't migrate for the sake of it. I know I'm up here saying that we've had a really good time migrating. Just because you're on a slightly older framework or there's something new comes out, it doesn't mean that's an excuse on its own to migrate. You should very strongly consider if this is the right approach. Plan, plan, and plan again. You can never plan too much, especially when you've got such a large project. It's very easy to miss bits. Cross-business communication is way more important than you might think, and the more effort you can put into that earlier, the better it will be for all in your company. Prioritize based on the pain points in your current application. This will also help your users and your other colleagues. Mix up tasks to keep things difficult. No, not to keep things difficult. Mix up tasks based on difficulty to keep it interesting. Definitely don't keep things difficult. Have metrics to track progress internally and externally, even if they're not the most scientific metrics on the earth. And don't expect to migrate perfectly the first time. There will be issues, you will make mistakes, you will learn from it, and that's part of the journey, and you should enjoy that as well, because I know I've learned a lot, both technically and not technically, since starting. So I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much for listening. I'd also like to say I'm dreadful at introducing myself to people in like a room, such as like at a party. So please do come and say hello. I don't bite. I'd love to just hear what you're working on. If you've got any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them as well. And I will see you at the party. So thank you very much for listening.